All right, hello again. This is one of my all-time favorite topics to talk about. Why have government? Here are some key terms and concepts that by the end of this lecture you should be familiar with. Collective action problems, public goods, private goods, club goods, common pool resources, and externalities. So, let's start off with a big general question. Why not just let people be free to do what they wish or to self-organize into voluntary communities by interest or by inclination? In other words, why have government at all? Here are some reasons that people have offered to answer this question. Avoid insecurity, mediate conflict, produce public goods, and promote justice. Now, the first three, security, conflict mediation, and public goods, and maybe even the fourth, are a variation on the same theme. People find themselves in situations where acting together is necessary to secure some good. Acting as an individual agent in voluntary cooperation with others is just not enough to secure the desired good. Now, acting together here, rather than acting alone, means that a group is acting as if directed by a single mind or intention. That is to say, everyone's acting according to the plan, so to speak. Now, typically, this sort of collective action is achieved through a mix of carrots, sticks, and social norms. What do I mean by that? Well, the carrots are inducements. So if a law says that if you have children, we will give you some extra money every month or at the end of your paycheck, then that is a kind of inducement to have children, to stick with the plan, as it were. Sticks are, of course, the punishments, and most forms of legal coercion have to do with punishment. So if you break the law, then there is a very good chance that you will be punished. Those are the sticks. And finally, social norms. Laws don't so much create social norms, although actually there's an argument to suggest that they might be able to. But social norms are sort of non-governmental ways by which we regulate social conduct. And we do that by socially punishing people who don't behave in the expected or desired fashion. So for instance, we might just avoid them or have more subtle consequences than legal consequences. And that's why it's not just government that achieves collective action, but firms and nonprofits also achieve collective action. They do so in very similar ways than government. Let me give you an example of a collective action problem. Contagion. It used to be that in the early 1800s that 12% of the population would die of smallpox and maybe 1% from tuberculosis. On top of that, we had periodic epidemics of typhus, cholera, yellow fever, and influenza, and these would kill millions, most especially children and the elderly. In almost all cases, there wasn't really much anybody could do by themselves to reduce their risk of mortality from these diseases. Bad water, bad sanitation systems, polluted air meant that individuals were just unable to do very much to affect the chances of being infected and possibly dying. So if you think about it, no one on their own could do much about the quality of the air or rivers or open sewers. If I stop polluting the rivers, if I stop belching smoke into the air, the overall air quality is not going to change very much. If we all do something about it, then maybe we can achieve some success in reducing the amount of air pollution, water pollution, and so on and so forth. But if we all chip in to go to the expense of building sewers and water treatment plants, maybe we can all improve our collective odds of avoiding these diseases. If we pass laws to prohibit building factories in the middle of where people live, or if we prohibit individuals from emptying their chamber pots into the drinking water supply, then our odds of survival probably go up a little bit. This is the payoff of acting together. We can get things done that we cannot achieve acting alone. Of course, the benefits are not just limited to keeping the disease environment tolerable. Can you think of some other areas where collective action yields positive results for everyone? I'll give you a minute to think about it. All right, here are some areas: national defense, law enforcement, fire protection, traffic laws, commercial law, contract enforcement, intellectual property protection, and preventing the destruction of forests, ecosystems, and species. All of these things I've mentioned have another name. They're called public goods. What are public goods? Public goods are the goods that can only be secured by successful collective action, and they have two important characteristics. They're non-rival and they're non-excludable. These characteristics define the good. Public goods are nothing else but the combination of these two features, at least to some degree. As we'll see in a minute, there's no such thing as a perfect public good. Let's talk about these criteria. First, non-rivalry. A good is non-rival when one person's use or enjoyment of a good does not diminish another person's use or enjoyment. So this is a very peculiar sort of good. If you think about it, most goods, private goods, my consumption makes it impossible for you to consume it. So for instance, if I'm eating a candy bar, whatever's left of the candy bar is less, and so your enjoyment of that candy bar is obviously diminished by my enjoying the candy bar. We can't both enjoy the candy bar at the same time. That's sort of a characteristic of private goods. But public goods have this weird characteristic where one person's enjoyment really doesn't diminish another person's enjoyment. So if you think about clean air, for example, I'm breathing clean air. That doesn't mean, in general, at least with respect to the world, that there's less clean air for anybody to breathe. Now, if we're talking about an elevator, that's a different story, but in general, clean air is non-rivalrous. Water free of cholera is another good example. National defense is another great example, right? If I'm protected, it doesn't diminish how much you are protected, right? My enjoyment of our missile shield doesn't diminish how much you are protected. We're all protected the same amount, and we all enjoy it without it diminishing anybody else's protection. Now, I grant that in the case of national defense, for instance, our national security may in fact diminish the security of other countries. If we are safe, that might actually diminish other people's safety. But within the public goods area, within our country, the good is non-rivalrous. At the world level, things may change a little bit. You'll learn about that if you study international politics. So we said a public good had to be non-rivalrous, or at least be to some degree non-rivalrous. It's also the case, and this is probably more important, that the good has to be non-excludable over a certain area. So what that means is once the good's produced, no one within the area can be excluded from its enjoyment. Another way of saying this is that it's almost impossible to exclude free riders from public goods. So national defense is non-excludable. If we have security within the area, then everyone in the area is secure. And anybody who makes it within the bounds of the United States is protected by the U.S. military. The U.S. military can't say, we're going to protect everyone, but not Kansas City. In theory, I guess you could try to do that, but ultimately you have to stop the tanks at the borders, and what that means is that you have to protect everyone once they are within your boundaries, right? So if the air is clean in the city, then everybody in the city gets clean air. It's non-excludable. We can't say everybody gets clean air except Bob, right? That's the non-excludability criteria. So a public good is simply a good with specific characteristics. It's not a description of who produces the goods, not a description of who enjoys the goods, it's not who profits from the good. The term public good is really misleading because it sounds like it's a good that's either produced for the public, by the public, or for the good of the public. And none of those things have to be true for something to technically be a public good. And that's really an important lesson here. You don't want to say a public good is anything produced by the government, because of course the government could open shoe factories tomorrow, and in communist country the government does produce lots of private goods, but just because the government produces it doesn't mean it's a public good. So just because the public enjoys a good doesn't mean it's a public good. For example, food. Everybody enjoys food, but food is not a public good. Yes, everybody enjoys it, everybody needs it, but that doesn't make it a public good. Food is very much a private good because it's both rivalrous and excludable. I can exclude you from my food, and my enjoyment of my food definitely diminishes your enjoyment of that same food. So pure public good is an ideal type. So we're going to talk about degrees of public goods. Right? There are things that have public goods like characteristics, where it's difficult to exclude people, where to some degree adding more people doesn't diminish anybody's enjoyment, but of course if you add too many people then it might diminish people's enjoyment. Those are still called public goods. They're just imperfect public goods, but to the degree there is really no such thing as a perfect public good, it's worth pointing out that all public goods are to some degree imperfect. Air runs out within an elevator. If you put too many people, the air becomes rivalrous. My use of oxygen definitely diminishes your enjoyment of oxygen. To make things a little more specific, we can talk about club goods and common pool resources. A club good is a good which is non-rival but excludable. Remember, non-rivalry means my enjoyment of the good doesn't diminish your enjoyment of the good. So an example of that would be a park, a TV station, a road, maybe even a nice painting. If I'm watching a TV station, that doesn't make anybody enjoy that TV station any less if they're watching it too. So a TV station is a club good. Same thing for a park. If I'm wandering through the park and enjoying a park, and you're wandering through the park and enjoying the park, I don't diminish your enjoyment of the park very much. Unless I'm engaging in some pretty awful behavior, I guess. Again, roads are the same to a certain extent. These are club goods. They're often called public goods, but in reality, they're club goods because they are excludable. That is to say, you can exclude someone from watching a TV station, you can exclude someone from roads through tolls or access points, and you can exclude people from parks with gates and guards and things like that. So all of these things are club goods because they're non-rival, but they're excludable. A common pool resources is the opposite. It's non-excludable, but rivalrous. So if you think of fish stock or deer population or air in the elevator that I mentioned earlier, these are all examples of rivalrous goods that you can't exclude people from, or it's very difficult to exclude people from. So think about fish stock, for example. It's very hard to stop people from fishing. You can, but in the ocean, the fish move around, and so they can be fished by nearly anyone. And so, but it's true that if I fish those fish, you can't fish those fish. So it's very clear that it's rivalrous, but it's difficult, if not impossible, to exclude people from consuming the good. So in general, club goods and common pool resources are imperfect public goods. They have public goods-like characteristics, but they're not pure or perfect. Now, sometimes club goods are produced by government, and sometimes they're produced by the private sector. So these straddle the limits of where we argue about whether the government or the private sector should produce this good. Usually, when club goods are produced by the private sector, the government has to regulate to some degree its production and distribution. Now, public policy debates are often about whether imperfect public goods are best provided by the government or by the private sector. For example, should government run schools, that is to say public schools, or should they subsidize and regulate a system of mostly private schools through vouchers or charter schools? This is an example of a live public policy debate about vouchers and charter schools. And what this is a debate about, really, if you think about it, is simply about whether a good which has public good-like characteristics, whether that good should be provided by the government or whether it should be provided by the private sector with regulation. Another type of good that is an imperfect public good are private goods whose production or use generates negative or positive effects on other people. And these external effects, these positive or negative effects generated on other people, are called externalities. Here's some examples of private goods that generate externalities. Think about coal, or education, or cars, or stereos, or currency speculation, or a Twitter comment and information more generally. These are all examples of goods whose production or use creates external effects on others. Of course, coal creates smoke and pollution and other things, both in its production and when it is consumed. Education creates typically more positive benefits in the sense that other people's education actually benefits you. If you live in a society that is more productive, where people have a higher level of education, what that means is that your costs of living probably go down a little bit and your quality of life goes up. Cars are another example, and that's probably a mixed benefit. Stereos, of course, create noise pollution. These are all examples of external effects on other people. So unlike public goods, which can only generally be provided by government, private goods that produce externalities can usually be produced privately, and if we want them produced at socially efficient levels, we're going to have some government regulation, or we may have to just allow those external effects to happen if the cure is worse than the disease. That is to say, if the government regulation is so costly and so intrusive that at the end of the day, it might be better off just to let them be produced by the market without regulation. So pollution restrictions, noise restrictions, traffic laws, gun laws, financial disclosure laws, education subsidies, all of these things are examples of regulations of private goods so that they will be produced in either greater quantities or lower quantities depending on whether we think that the society needs greater or lower quantities of that good. So why have government? Let's sum things up. What is it the government can do for us that we cannot accomplish on our own or in voluntary cooperation with others? Solve collective action problems, help secure public goods, manage the externalities involved in the production and use of private goods. But what about justice? What about protecting the vulnerable and innocent from the powerful and corrupt? What about fostering virtue, duty, and civic responsibility? What about protecting individual liberty and freedom? Shouldn't government do that too? Shouldn't government be more than just regulating externalities and providing public goods? And I think that's almost certainly true. But note that freedom, norms of decency and responsibility, and even justice itself can be understood as kinds of public goods like order and security. These things need to be produced and need to be consumed by citizens. So to the extent that they can be produced and consumed, they can be treated to some degree as if they were public goods. Now, I don't believe the whole story about justice is a story about public goods, but it's interesting how much things fall into place once we start talking about things like justice, order, security, and norms as goods with certain abstract properties. That is to say, they're non-rival or they're non-excludable. Analyzing things in this way can help us see when goods, including justice, are very likely to be under or overproduced. Now, I don't want to leave you with a Panglossian vision of real-world governments. Panglossian is a lovely word that is a neologism taken from Voltaire's Candide. Dr. Pangloss always thought that the world was always as great a place as it could possibly be. So think of Panglossian as meaning seeing the world through rose-tinted glasses. Just because the government can theoretically do something helpful does not mean that the real-world governments actually live up to those standards. Political science is, in part, the study of collective action, but it also frequently documents the failures of governments to achieve successful collective action. Sometimes government is not just part of the solution, it's part of the problem. So in the coming lectures, we'll be talking about the Constitution. The American founders knew very well that governments were both useful but also dangerous tools. Power is power. Once you give it away, you might not like how it is being used. George Washington likened government to fire, a useful tool if you can make it work for you, but also to be treated with utmost caution. The trick was to create a government that could solve collective action problems, but was also limited and controlled enough that it would not become a threat to the citizens.